Welcome, all of you. Hopefully, this is recording, and hopefully, the audio is adequate and the visual effects are likewise commensurate with your expectations. As you can see, my production values are off the charts here. I actually rented this. This is a studio that I set up particularly for this recording episode here. I've got a lot of history books and philosophy books and law books on the shelf here, so it is to set sort of the mood and the ambiance. Got a nice window, got the right amount of light filtering through here to sort of enhance the aesthetic here. No, I'm making this all up actually. This is my parents' house and this is my dad's office in that house. But it's a very suitable environment, I think, for the purpose of this particular lecture. I think it's a venue that is in many ways supplementary, aesthetically at least, and I think it hopefully sets the mood, sets the stage for what we're about to talk about, since we are talking about philosophy today. Not only philosophy, before you just completely run out on me and mute this or whatever it is you might conceivably do. Not just philosophy, but we're going to be talking about philosophy in conjunction with history, because you can't just understand the history of the 17th and 18th century in France in particular without being able to place it in the proper philosophical and intellectual context, thereby furthering and enhancing your appreciation for why the events unfolded in the way that they did, and precisely what it was intellectual, anyways, that animated people to do what they were doing. So that's the context of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, before I delve into the actual substance, which is going to be shortly forthcoming, there's a couple of just brief sort of perfunctory announcements I'm going to make here. First of all, I hope that this meets with your approval. All right. And I don't just mean the environment and the trappings of my ad hoc sort of studio that I have here. I mean that I hope that this particular venue, this modality, this methodology of communication is sufficient for your purposes. And if for any reason it's not, and I was very explicit about this in the email that I sent out, and hopefully you have had the opportunity to engage with that thus far and actually read what I said. But if you haven't, please do take the time to do that, because by the time you will have, by the time you will be actually let me make sure this is actually recording, guys, because I got a sneaking suspicion that maybe it's not. And okay, yes, it seems to be recording, and if it's not, then there's going to be some serious problems here, and I'm going to be extremely upset with myself. And we might just then have to reduce ourselves to Zoom. But the email that I sent out, I think it was on Friday, and I know it was Friday night, and I know it's a holiday weekend, and I know probably many of you haven't had the opportunity or the inclination to actually look at it yet. But when you get around to it, hopefully you do that before you actually view this, because they're meant to be viewed sort of sequentially. So what I say in that email, all right, and this does not obviate the need for actually reading the email in its entirety, just about the basis of what I'm about to convey here to you. But just succinctly here, what I said is that I have essentially come to the decision that it behooves us collectively, not just me. In fact, it behooves, I think, you much more so than myself. It is in your interest more so than it is my interest to go ahead and to relegate at least for the foreseeable future, and by that I mean for the next three lectures, relegate the lecture content to the venue of YouTube. And if, as I say, I think there are some compelling reasons as to why we ought to at least consider that. And that's, first of all, and I think perhaps foremost amongst which, is the fact that pursuant to the outcome of that survey, the survey wasn't completely unanimous in favor of the YouTube proposition in contrast to the Zoom proposition. But I think there were 8 of you that participated in the survey. No, 7 of you that participated in the survey. There were 8 of you that were there that day, and only 7 of you actually saw fit to answer my questions. But 6 out of 7 expressed their desire, their approval for YouTube as opposed to Zoom. And I don't know what the motivating factors were. Quite frankly, it doesn't really matter. But that's a majority, okay? And out of those 6 out of the 7, I think 5 out of those 6 that were in support of YouTube were in support substantially so. Were much more in favor of YouTube than they were in favor of Zoom. Now, I tried to make the argument on both sides, and I think that the argument, it seems to me anyways, the argument for YouTube, for you as far as a student is concerned, should be more compelling then the reasons as to why you might conceivably be interested in doing this via Zoom. It's not just about avoiding having to get up early in the morning, which obviously is a strong motivation for yours truly, but maybe not so much for you because you don't care about that because you got to be up anyways. I don't know. But I think the real slam dunk argument in favor of YouTube, and maybe I'm completely wrong about this, and maybe I'm just misconstruing things, and if I am, you got to let me know. All right, but I would submit to you anyways, is that if we do this via Zoom, and we do it via Zoom consistently, and it becomes sort of a recurrent sort of trend, then I have no reason to say that we ought not actually take the exam in the classroom with all the formalities associated with that. And then there's going to be time constraints, and there's also going to be constraints in terms of what you can and cannot use. In fact, you cannot use anything but your own mind, i.e. your memory, and therefore everything that you recapitulate in the course of the exam questions is going to have to derive from your knowledge, which itself is going to be predicated upon your having immersed yourself in the materials, therefore requiring a great deal of work and effort and time investment and all the other sort of things that are ancillary to that process. Now, that obviously is highly conducive to learning. And after all, that's what we're in this, the whole point of the undertaking is to learn, you would think, all right? And obviously to have a little bit of fun along the way, but primarily it is to learn. And if you're in this to learn, then it seems to me that we ought to structure the examinations in such a way that is maximally conducive in furtherance of the learning itself, that is maximally edifying, that forces you to actually immerse yourself in the materials. But look, I realize that not all of you are exclusively and fundamentally motivated exclusively by the desire to learn as much as you possibly can, and therefore immerse yourself in the most intellectually challenging environment that is conducive to actually furthering that objective. I understand that some of you really don't care about that. That's fine. You're more concerned about getting that A or making that B or just making the grade. Okay, that's fine. I totally understand that. So if we do this via YouTube, I can't very well impose upon you mandatory requirement that you show up to a classroom and you take this exam. How am I going to proctor it? I can't proctor it. YouTube's not live, right? Maybe it is live streamed, but I don't have the knowledge or the technical aptitude to be able to do that. So you're off the hook as far as a physical actual exam would be concerned if in fact we continue along this trajectory with YouTube. Now, if you guys decide, well, I'm not sure about YouTube, I really don't like watching videos on YouTube because that's just unbecoming of an academic sort of environment, well, whatever your qualms may happen to be subjective, I don't know what they are, and you don't tell me what they are. But if your preference is for Zoom, well, guess what? There's something that goes along with that, all right? And the connotation that's going to go along with that is that if we go with Zoom, and this is not my sort of contrived effort to disabuse you of the notion that Zoom is a good idea, to impose something onerous upon you if in fact you do select Zoom. That's not what I'm doing at all. This is not, as I say, some contrived effort on my part. No, I'm just saying that this is just as a matter of course, as a matter of fact, if we do Zoom, then there's no reason not to have the exams in the classroom. So option A, YouTube, don't have to get up early, maybe slightly less conducive to actually learning stuff, but you know what, as far as I'm concerned, the degree to which you invest yourself in this process, whether it's Zoom, whether it's YouTube, whether it's anything else, is the extent to which you actually get something out of it. So what you put into it is what you get out of it, or there's a very strong, almost symmetrical correlation between those two. So if you just care about learning, then hey, YouTube is, as far as I'm concerned, not in any way going to detract from that. All right, it's not going to devalue or diminish the efficacy of your learning potential just because you're watching this on YouTube as opposed to on Zoom. The only thing that I can think that Zoom would add that YouTube doesn't add is the opportunity for constructive dialogue and discourse and some kind of dialectical dynamic in the exchange between me and you. But I haven't seen much evidence of that thus far in this class, right? You guys seem very content just sitting back, just kind of being quiet, and maybe it's because you're a lugubrious group, and maybe it's just because it's a very ungodly hour of the morning, and maybe it's just because, you know, my style is just so exuberant that it doesn't really, there's no air in the room to breathe, right? So there's just no, I don't know, whatever it is, right? But there doesn't seem to me as such, in the last 2 weeks, and I've got, 8 hours of cumulative experience now to say this, doesn't seem to be much of a pressing need anyways, to actually have much of an exchange or an interplay or a dynamic, a dialogue, if you will, because it's just been monologue thus far. It's been, I don't know, 99.5% monologue, just me up there talking about whatever. Fine. I don't have a problem with that. That's totally fine, right? But if that's what it's going to be, then it seems to me to say that there's no need for Zoom, because Zoom would only make a difference, a substantial difference, if in fact this was a class which relied upon that dynamic exchange, that there was a dialectical, that there was a dialogue actually transpiring, and that was absolutely quintessential and indispensable in furtherance of actually learning the sorts of things that you need to learn and take away from this class. Doesn't seem to me to be the case that actually is true. So that would be the only argument that I could constructively conceive of in favor of, in support of Zoom, as opposed to in lieu of YouTube. But I'm not maybe sufficiently imaginative. Maybe there are other arguments, maybe there are other considerations that come into this, maybe there are other concerns that you might have. If there's any of that you want to convey to me, by all means, please do convey to me. But I think we've had a sufficient a period of time has now lapsed since I promulgated that email and basically said, at least for the next week and a half. So this particular lecture, and I hope you guys are going to watch it from A to Z, all right, not just skip through and just kind of, hope that you hit the important parts without actually seeing it in its entirety, because there are going to be parts of this lecture that are more important than others, and I can't tell you exactly where they're going to be, because it just depends on where I'm at in relation to the material. But what I'm going to say is that this lecture is intended to be watched in conjunction with Wednesday's class, this coming Wednesday, which is September 6th, I think. No, today's the 5th, today's Sunday, so that will be the 7th, I think. 6th, 7th, the 8th, excuse me, September 8th, whatever that is, Wednesday, all right? It's either the 7th or the 8th. I'm not very good with math, as you can tell here. But this is meant to be the substitute, the class, if you will, for this coming Wednesday, the 8th of September, the 7th of September, whatever happens to be that date. Now, I am also planning on doing this style of presentation for the following Monday, as well as for the Wednesday after that. Okay? Now, if there are any very serious constructive criticisms that you have, or any serious inhibitions that you have concerning the way in which this actually plays out, because you're just so inimical to YouTube for whatever reasons, it just totally puts you off their learning mentality, that you just can't concentrate because there's too many distractions on the side. I don't know, that wouldn't be a very good argument, because you can just maximize the screen so it just zooms out and it forecloses on any of the distractions that might be embedded in the YouTube page. But if there are any very serious concerns that you may conceivably have, and I don't know, I can't anticipate these things, right? Then you need to be vocal and you need to express those. Either articulate them in the context of an email, or actually just pick up the phone and call me. And I think I told a couple of you, anyways, to do precisely that. So we've had a comment period, all right? A comment period on the decision that I have made, not unilaterally. This is a decision that is in furtherance of the collective will of the group as it was expressed in the context of that survey. So I am the instrument of the people's will, if you will. If that's not too much of a syllogism for you, which I hope it's not. And so I'm just enacting a policy that is consistent with what you guys told me you wanted. All right, I'm doing no more and no less than that. All right. So I don't see how you could really fault me for saying, let's do YouTube, right? Because personally, as I said before in that email, if you read it in its entirety, I don't care either way. We can do YouTube, we can do Zoom. I think both have their pros, both have their cons. I don't have a preference. I don't like having to talk to myself for the better part of 2 hours, for an hour and a half, or however long it's end up actually being. It's actually much, much more difficult for me to sit here and to go on and on and on and on for an hour and however long it's going to be. It doesn't matter how long it's going to be, whether it's 10 minutes, whether it's 120 minutes. It doesn't matter. It's very difficult. In fact, one student told me, very presciently observed, she said, Jeff, if you can lecture to an empty room for a period of however long it happens to be, whether it's a 4-hour class or it's a 2-hour class, then you can lecture to just about anybody, because that's the biggest challenge. And I really do need a studio audience. I'm no good without anybody, so I'm probably going to ask my girlfriend to come in here the next time, and maybe we'll have some kind of interactive dialogue. We'll talk trash about my ex. I don't know. But whatever it is, I'm going to try to make this as interesting as I possibly can. Okay, so those are the announcements, all right? And I think I've covered all of them. And I don't want to waste too much time on this perfunctory sort of stuff, but it's important to get this out of the way, and it's absolutely indispensable for your purposes anyways, to ensure that you listen to this video in its entirety. You can't afford not to, let's just put it that way, because there's going to be bits of insight and wisdom and things that are really very salient and very probative in determining how you're going to understand the material going forward that you might otherwise miss if you don't listen to the entirety of this video. So I understand that's for some of you that's an imposition, but hey, you voted for YouTube. All right, I'm just implementing that which you as a group expressed your desire for. Okay, so I'm doing, again, nothing more than that. All right. The lighting in here is very bad, so I'm going to be moving around a little bit just so I can actually see what I'm talking about here. Um, today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution. Okay. Now you may be saying, well, why bother, right? Who cares? Who cares about the French Revolution? What's the big deal about the French Revolution? Well, remember this is a Western civilization class, and because it's a Western civilization class, the things that we're going to be concerned with pertain to the development of Western civilization. I mean, that goes without saying, right? That's a bit of a tautology. But how one of the questions that I ask myself, I mean, there's a series of questions that I think we have to ask ourselves in the context of framing this particular discussion. All right, you got to have a particular methodological approach to this. And thus far, by the way, in this class, all we've been talking about is methodology, right? How to actually approach history, the discipline of history, understanding and interpreting the past, using analytical frameworks for doing so. We've talked about methodology, and I guess we've talked a little bit about theory. Okay, we've talked about theory in the abstract, right? There are different types of approaching history. There's always a different perspective. You know, there's two different perspectives in terms of the trajectory of Western civilization in the last course of the last 500 years. There's our author's school of thought, the Niall Ferguson school of thought, which emphasizes economics, it emphasizes law, it emphasizes the institutions, the 5 institutions that he talks about. He calls them killer apps, which I think is a bit disingenuous. And then there's the other way of approaching Western civilization, and that's the other guy, this Jared Diamond, right? Who says it's more about ecology and biology and geography, and it's a function of that tripartite, that trifectate of those 3 considerations. Those 3 things contribute to the very substantial differentiation between the trajectory of Eastern Asia and Central and Western Europe, and how they ended up where they are today. So the point is there's different ways of looking at things. Now, I've got a particular way of looking at the series of events which constitute the French Revolution. Just because it's my particular interpretation doesn't necessarily mean that you have to just drink the Kool-Aid and accept every single thing that I say, because there's all these kind of underlying propositions, underlying presuppositions that are built into much of what I say that you can accept or you can reject. It's up to you, right? But if you choose to argue against what I'm saying, well, then it's incumbent upon you to do so in a way that is rationally based, that is intelligently articulated, and that is predicated on the facts. And you're welcome to do that, because much of this is interpretive. So let's go back to some of the fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves when we delve into the substance, the substrat of Western civilization, because that's what we're going to be getting into today. First of all, I want to know this. Okay, and maybe you don't care about this, but it seems to me to be a fundamental question that is really operative in the context of what we're going to be examining, particularly today, but also forthcoming information. What connections exist between historical events over the course of the last, let's call it the last 350 years, okay? We don't have to go all the way back to 500 years ago, because this class technically starts at 1750, I think it is. So that's right around 350 years ago, right? 250 years ago, I guess that would be 206, 70 years. Yeah, we'll call it 3. Let's round it up to 300 years, right? In the last 300 years, what systemic historical events, right? Widespread macro historical events have occurred in the context of Western civilizations, right? So we already defined what Western civilizations are. The United States, right, and the precursor to the United States, which is France and Western Europe as a whole, right, and much of Southern Europe, okay, and all the colonies and all the overseas holdings that those places began to propagate to and subjugate and then gain economic and geopolitical control over. That's the West, okay? The West as a sort of a monolithic conceptual notion as to what it is. We got to have some definitional context to that so we can actually understand what we're talking about. But in that vein, okay, in the context of our study of the West, the examination of Western civilization in the last 300 years, what large-scale systemic events can we look to and say that these events are related to subsequent events? Are there certain events that are recurrent in the trajectory, the developmental trajectory of Western civilization? Are there certain events that are recurrent? Do they happen? Do they play out again and again and again, time and time again? And do they have certain patterns, identifiable, discernible patterns to them? We can say that this particular series of events is very similar to a series of events that came before it that looked a lot like it, right?
So that's the first question. The second question, I think, is how did we get to where we are today? Our author talks a lot about the rule of law. He talks about nation states that are predicated on a foundation of the rule of law, whereby we are a nation of laws. We defer to the supremacy of the legislature and what they determine to be good laws and bad laws, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do we ever get to that, right? Because we went, the West, and I say we, I mean the West, Western civilization went from being primarily a monarchy, right? A government not by the people, for the people, or of the people, but rather a government of one autocratic individual, i.e., the king, i.e., the queen. All right. It went from a government which was ruled exclusively under the domain and the dominion of one particular individual who very autocratically and unilaterally determined how the affairs of state were going to be conducted. It went from that to being a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to usurp language of the United States Constitution. So that's interesting too. All right. Now I submit to you, right, before we embark upon the French Revolution, I submit to you that when we are trying to examine those questions, it is absolutely quintessential. It is absolutely paramount of a paramount importance and indispensable historical value for us to understand the nature of revolution, because we have had many revolutions in the West in the last 300 years. Most recently, I would say we had the, well, I guess it depends on how you define revolution, but I would say the Russian Revolution of 1917 and 1918, right? The Russian Revolution. The proletariat, as Marx referred to them as, overthrew the bourgeoisie, all right? The very poor, right? The working class, the peasants, the workers, the soldiers, they overthrew the aristocracy, the old aristocracy, the princes and the dukes and the monarchy and the czar. And much of the ideology that facilitated the Russian Revolution came from a guy by the name of Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx was a philosopher in the 19th century, in the 1850s and 60s in Germany. It's kind of ironic that the ideology that fomented and precipitated the Russian Revolution actually came from a German, and then that ideology, which created the communist Soviet empire, was instrumental in creating the Soviet state, which then became the nemesis of a future Germany. So there are certain ironies in history, and that's one of the reasons why I like studying it, because it's really, I think I just get a kick out of looking at these little details, these little subtleties, and saying, oh well, that's ironic. Look at that, because that could have happened some other way, but it didn't. Maybe I get too excited about these things, and well, you guys are not here to tell me whether or not my excitement is unwarranted, but I'll assume that it is. So Karl Marx got his ideas, a lot of his ideas derived from much of the philosophy that actually gave rise to the French Revolution itself. So that, to my mind, is an inextricable, incontrovertible connection between what happened in the context of France in the 1740s and the 1750s, and then what happened 100 years later in Germany when Marx was sitting down at his writing desk and sitting down and thinking, cogitating to himself, ruminating upon the ironies of history, and he was formulating his ideology, and he was talking about how we need to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the people who control the means of production. We need to disseminate those means to the workers and the populace, and create a more egalitarian system that is more, gives greater consideration and deference for the interests of the people, and etc. And these ideas have their incipient origin, their point of origin, in much of the philosophy that really underpinned the foundations of the French Revolution, which inspired the revolutionary ethos, which eventually began to precipitate a physical revolution against the French monarchy. So I think that that's one of the connections that we can look to. And then we can say, well, the American Revolution happened right around the same time. It happened in the 1770s. Now, the French Revolution had already happened at that time, or it had already sort of reached its, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that. The French Revolution was in the process of happening at that time. And so I think that because the French Revolution and the American Revolution were in many ways sort of contemporaneous with each other, they kind of fed off one another, all right? And so there were ideas being borrowed by the ideologues who were responsible for the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, the founding fathers, the framers, as we refer to them as in jurisprudence. You look at the writings of Thomas Paine and Hamilton and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And there is a very strong correlation between the ideas that they articulate in their writings and the ideas that were expressed by the guys, I don't know, over there in France, Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, right? Some of the philosophers who gave rise to the ideas which eventually animated and operationalized the French Revolution itself. So I think that there was this sort of mutual exchange of ideas, and this is one of the things that is absolutely dispositive in determining how the Enlightenment actually works. You can't understand the Enlightenment just as sort of an abstraction, right? What is the Enlightenment, right? Well, the Enlightenment, to my mind, means the profusion of ideas, right? It means let's go out there and let's share as many ideas as we possibly can and just promulgate these ideas and propagate these ideas and disseminate these ideas as roundly and as loudly as we possibly can so that as many people are aware of these things so that we can start talking about these ideas and thinking about these ideas and sharing their own interpretations of these notions. And then we can have a profusion of new ideas, and this will lead down the road of enlightenment because there's going to be a lot of people thinking about these things in different ways. Now that, it seems to me, is that process, anyways, is inextricably associated with the process of revolutionary thought. All right. So let's use all of this sort of conceptual backdrop that I'm creating here for you. Let's use all of this to kind of frame and interpret the actual what's actually happening in the French Revolution historically. What's actually happening? How the French Revolution actually plays out. So bear that in mind. So let's talk about. I think before we actually get into what the French Revolution is, let's talk about what actually caused the French Revolution. So when I talk about the causes, there's a couple of very important causes, and I think we need to. It behooves us to differentiate between these causes and to sort of make this list, an itemized list. Now remember, this is analytically driven, so make sure you make a note of this stuff, right? By the way, all of you should be, presumably, I hope you're doing this. I don't know whether or not you're doing this, but if you're not, you should be doing this. Take notes on what's going on here, all right? Thus far, much of what I said is just sort of introductory material, but it's an important introduction because it gives you context for what's about to happen here. But I think it behooves you, it's incumbent upon you to take notes, take good notes, so that you can understand this stuff, because this stuff is going to be testable material, all right? I've also decided probably not to actually use the slides in conjunction with what I'm doing right now. You guys have the slides, and the slides, as far as I'm concerned, at least as far as they relate to this material that I'm talking about right now, they give you sort of supplemental information. But a lot of the stuff on the slides is kind of redundant because I'm going to incorporate much of what's in the slides in what I actually say, because everything that's in the slides is contained in my notes that I have here in front of me. So as long as you're listening to me, if you don't really understand what I'm talking about, right, or whatever it is I'm saying doesn't really resonate with you in a way that allows for you to completely apprehend the subtleties of whatever we're talking about, then go to the slides, appeal to the slides, try to get that information out of that. And if you still don't understand it, then call me, text me. Well, don't text me because my phone really isn't conducive to actually reading or interpreting or especially responding to text. But send me an email or shoot me, give me a call. So there's a couple of factors that I list and say that these are absolutely the causes, the fundamental causes of revolution in France. First, we start off with the economic and the social. And then secondly, we're going to talk about the ideological. Okay, so there's two separate primary causes of the French Revolution. There's first you have the economic and the social, and then secondly you have the ideological. Right, so let's delve into the economic. In the middle to the by the late 1700s, let's call it, by the late 1700s, France was a very poor nation. It was poor because it had been fighting many wars, overseas wars. Now, we know from our experience, the United States experience in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. I think Afghanistan was actually a more expensive war. But Afghanistan was it's our forever war, right? We've been fighting it since 2001, I think, 2002, right? So going on 20 years. And it has cost not just billions of dollars, it has cost trillions of dollars, right? So foreign overseas wars are extraordinarily expensive, right? Because they involve logistics. They involve getting people, men and materials overseas over to wherever it happens to be the theater of war actually is, right? And France had been fighting overseas wars because France was a colonial overseas empire for much of its history up until this point. In fact, France got into the colonial overseas game very early on, not as early as Spain, not as early as Portugal, and not quite as early as well, actually about around the same time as England did. right? But there have been French colonies in North America for a very long time. Canada, and I think even before then, go down to the West Indies, because when Columbus first set foot in North America, he actually thought he was in India because he thought he was going the other way. So the French have been overseas for a very long time. They were in West Africa. In fact, you go to West African countries right now today, and they still speak French in many of those countries, precisely because that's a vestigial remnant of the fact that the French were the founding fathers of many of those nations. So France had overseas colonies, right? They had this territory that they had to maintain, they had to secure, they had to build the infrastructure there, they had to maximize the exploitation of the natural resources, because that was the reason why they were over there in the first place. And then they were fighting wars. Of course, we should perhaps know this, for those of you who have taken American history, U.S. history, you know anything about U.S. history. One of the wars that the French was involved in was the French and Indian War, okay, whereby they fought against the British. The British were actually aligned with the colonists at that time, the future antagonists. The British, of course, later fought against the colonists in the American Revolution. But the French and Indian War was occurring around this time in the 1750s, early 1760s, right? And that was a very expensive undertaking for the French. For the French Empire. So there was a very large national debt that accumulated over the course of by the middle period of the 1700s.